So, Eamon, welcome to the show. I'm really pleased to have you. First of all, how have you been coping in these really crazy times?
I have found that it's had some serious benefits and some serious negatives. Like I actually, once I got used to the different rhythm of life, not being able to take the train into London twice a week has sort of
Mhm.
improved my productivity. But I'm kind of bored. I know it's necessary. I know we all have to do our bit, but I'm done with this, and I'm looking forward to going to the pub again.
Oh no, I don't blame you. I don't blame you. But I suppose I suppose for somebody like yourself who's constantly looking at problems, this is just one of those frustrating moments where you can't do nothing about it.
Yeah, you're. This is not what I research. I am powerless in this arena. It's I've you know
So tell me, what do you do? Actually research.
So, what I do at a high level is I look at a certain kind of cryptographic protocol. So, something that's designed, say, to keep messages secure except for people who you intend to read them on a general level. I look at them, such things that are based on mathematical objects called lattices.
Mhm.
So I don't know, a simple lattice in three-dimensional space, which you can visualize in your head, is you stack sugar cubes so that they're perfectly square on top of each other. And
Mhm.
the corners of all of these sugar cubes are your lattice points. It's just like a nice repeating, tessellating object in space. Um, Turns out, if you forget about wanting to visualize these objects and you go into thousands of dimensions, there are certain problems which computers aren't very good at, which you can base cryptography on.
Mhm.
And one reason that these are particularly interesting is that listeners may have heard in the news about the ever coming advent of quantum computers, which compute in a totally different way and will revolutionize all manner of things. Quantum computers also aren't good at these problems, and so maybe cryptography based on these objects called lattices is something we're interested in simply because one day the bad guys, and you can insert whoever you like, depending on your political affiliation or your worldview. The bad guys one day may have a quantum computer, and you may still want to communicate securely. So what I do is I look at these things and I try and break them. You kind of you role play as an adversary to try and get a more sort of holistic understanding of the security of this cryptography.
So is it essentially part of your work is to be the ethical hacker who's trying to figure it out?
Yeah, ethical hacker is a nice way to put it. Like, I actually don't have many hacking skills. I'm trained as a mathematician, and the inner workings of computers are still somewhat mysterious to me. But yeah, effectively, somebody specifies, say, an algorithm or something to do with lattices, and in theoretical cryptography, you have a reduction to a problem you expect to be hard, which
Mm.
is like a high-minded way of saying, if you can break this thing I've designed, you can also break this problem that I think is hard. And
Mhm.
since I think this problem is hard, you can't break this thing I've designed. That's kind of
Mhm.
how the field works. And then you also have concrete and practical attacks where you actually like maybe implement uh, certain schemes, and you actually see, like, if I were actually to try and break this and I completely forgot about all these formal reductions, like, what can I do? And
Mhm.
that's the sort of intersection where I work.
So there, as you mentioned, there's this assumption that the adversary at some point is going to have access to quantum computers or large quantum computers. How realistic an assumption is this?
Well, I mean, it really depends who you ask. And I'd like to come back to this even after I give my answer and tell us, or tell the listeners, why you would still be interested in quantum safe cryptography. But
Mhm.
so the running joke is that quantum computers have been 20 years away for 30 years.
Mhm.
Um, but that is maybe slightly disingenuous because huge strides have been taken in recent years. Like IBM have a 50 qubit quantum computer. Qubits are the quantum analog of bits, and that's tiny by classical standards in the sense that your computer that you're using now probably has 8 gigabytes of RAM or 4 gigabytes of RAM or something. But you ask some people and they tell you it's an engineering problem. and that simply you need to throw the engineers at it, eventually they'll get it to work. And you ask other people, and there seem to be some sort of fundamental issues with our current model of quantum computing that mean they don't think it'll get very much further. For example, in your computer, in a classical memory, bits take values of zeros or one, and these positions, 0 or 1, they're what we call like energetically separated. It's very unlikely that a bit that should be a 0 will randomly, due to some physical process, switch to being a 1. And you can imagine if that happens en masse in your computer's memory, everything goes to pot. At least for the kind of IBM style quantum computer, the same is not true of qubits. Like, you have a qubit that takes a much more, let's say, a value with much higher fidelity. It can be many values, not just 0 or 1.
Okay.
And to keep it at the value it needs to be, that's a really hard task. You have to do a huge amount of computing and measuring and reinitializing and all manner of operations there. And so some people would argue there's this inherent barrier to going much larger with our current designs of quantum computers, because this error correction, as it's called, where you keep the qubit as the value it should be, is so very expensive. So, like, I don't know, it really does depend who you ask. The question now is, if we can't get large-scale quantum computers, if we can't push the number of qubits into the regimes that is required, can people, quantum algorithm designers, instead design algorithms that make use of a small number of qubits? Because when people design quantum algorithms in the past, there was this implicit assumption that eventually they'd start to have memories of comparable sizes to classical computers, and algorithms were like designed for that use case. Now that maybe isn't going to be the case. It's not necessarily the death of quantum computing. It just means that people are looking for algorithms that can either use a small number of qubits or can tolerate this noise. And so, so the question of like, when will a quantum computer appear, even that is somehow poorly motivated. It's such a difficult question to even phrase.
Can I ask about the sort of what you've described as our sort of classical computers having these values that can't just change, and quantum computers having this possibility that they can change. Does that make them inherently more susceptible to attacks?
In the sense that if your attack is to sort of to perturb or to make false a quantum computation, I guess if you were physically present, you could turn off the cooling units and everything would just fall apart. Yes. But the fact that these fundamental like units, these qubits, can take so many more values than just 0, 1 is sort of, at least intuitively, this is not a proof, but intuitively related to the fact that what they can compute is so different from classical computers. So you exactly use these physical properties to design algorithms that have very different properties to ones we know classically. But so say a quantum computer is 50 years away. There are still two reasons I think the work that me and colleagues at Royal Holloway and other universities around the world do into post-quantum cryptography is valid. And they're twofold. The first is, here's a threat model that many people maybe don't consider, is, communications across the internet and across your devices, maybe using Signal or other messaging apps, are encrypted, but somebody can still store them, right? They can save them even if they can't decrypt them. And the idea being that the cryptography currently used is weak to quantum attack. So if you're a government agency, you store petabytes of this stuff, and you just leave it on some hard disk in some basement somewhere until maybe one day you have a quantum computer, at which point you can decrypt it. So, like, when a quantum computer appears is almost not the point. As long as you believe that it will appear, you want cryptography that's secure against quantum attack as soon as possible. Because like, there's nothing we can do about it. Those embarrassing messages I sent to people I had crushes on when I was 14, like, there's some tiny probability that they're stored in the basement somewhere of some national security agency, some other 3-letter or 4-letter acronym, and one day might be decrypted. And like, that's not of like that's not of critical importance to me, but you see the premise. So even though, let's say quantum computers appear in 50 years, I'd still like internet communications, for example, to be secured with post-quantum cryptography next year. So that I only have to worry about the things I said in the first 27 years of my life and not in the first 50 years of my life.
Yeah. So can I ask, just on that point, so post quantum cryptography, is it a fledgling sort of sector in cryptography, or is it something that's been around for a while?
I'd say, so certain pieces of classical cryptography are sort of innately post-quantum secure. So they've been around since the sort of dawn of cryptography as a distinct subject from, say, theoretical computer science or mathematics, since like the 80s or something. Things that, like one-way functions, let's say, for anybody who wants to Google that term. But as a distinct like a recognized and distinct subcategory of cryptography, I'd say since the mid-90s, so about 25 years, something like that. At least lattice-based cryptography, like in my, some of the fundamental results came out of IBM in the mid-90s, a guy called Itai. But in recent years, the interest has really exploded because of the strides various private companies have made towards building larger and larger quantum computers. And indeed, the American standards body, NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, they've gone so far as to start a standardization process, which is this ongoing process, which started, I think, back in 2016 towards the end, where industry and academia were asked to submit proposals for what post-quantum cryptography might look like, and they're aiming to standardize them by 2025, with the idea that, say, the big internet companies like Firefox, Chrome, etc., actually start to use this cryptography when you're communicating with the server at ebay.co.uk or something, right? So there is I wouldn't call it a nascent subcategory of cryptography. It's not as old as some, but it's certainly one of the sort of most active areas in cryptographic research at the moment.
And essentially the entire field, as I understand it, is all anticipatory. Like you're anticipating the sort of arrival of quantum computing, and you want to have these standards to sort of avoid any malice at the beginning.
Yeah. I was a scout and we were always told to be prepared. But yeah, the idea is, so the thing is, you come up with some new cryptography in an office in a university somewhere. What do you think the lag period is before it's used in practice, if it ever is? I don't know if people think it's like a year, 2 years. No, it's like maybe even 2 decades.
Yeah.
And not only that, it takes a long time for people to totally stop using old cryptography. So there's this real lag period. So that's one reason why it's good to be prepared. And one reason why, for example, NIST are running this competition in a time frame that some people not familiar with the subject might think is so preemptory or far too prophylactic. But there's another point of it, is that cryptography is a very interconnected discipline, and lots of work that has come out of the post-quantum field has really found its home in other fields as well. So even this morning, a colleague of mine was talking about fully homomorphic encryption, which is this like holy grail of cryptography. It means that I can encrypt data, send it to a much more powerful computer, and it can compute a function on that data without ever decrypting it. So like this is incredible that it exists, and it does, and it's incredible. But there's nothing that needs to be inherently post-quantum about fully homomorphic encryption, but the implementations and the schemes and the ideas that it uses are almost the same as a great deal of lattice-based post-quantum cryptography. They use cyclotomic rings of conductor 2n, right? So whatever that means, that's what they use. And so much work has been done on that in the context of post-quantum cryptography, and all of that work is applicable to this stuff that's got nothing to do with post-quantum cryptography. So So, it's a standardization process, especially for academics, is like a poker up the backside. And, if you want something done, try and standardize it. So, so that's why, we're doing this. I used a wonderful phrase. I can't remember what you used. It's like in advance, effectively. That's why.
Can I ask? I want to sort of talk about a bit about your earlier experiences and what led you down this path, because it's a really sort of niche area that, if you ask somebody what you'd like to do in a couple of years' time, they wouldn't say study lattice. But
How many mathematicians have you hung out with in your life?
I've hung around with a few, but I mean, to be honest with you, not the type. I don't think they're the type of mathematicians you want to be around. But so tell me a bit about sort of what inspired your journey to where you are right now.
Well, I wanted to come to London to do my undergraduate, and I was a poorly socially adjusted nerd for my entire first 18 years of life, and I basically enjoyed mathematics and history. And I thought it would be easier to keep history as a hobby than mathematics, so I chose to study mathematics in London. And then 4 years zoomed past, and I got a degree in mathematics at Imperial, and then the whole wide vista of being an adult appeared. What on earth shall I do now? And it was, I had always had an interest in cryptography, although I didn't really know it. Me and my other friends would create trivially breakable codes to like communicate securely and all the rest of it. And I was interested in using the like highly formal maths that I'd learned in a way that was somehow tangible. I say that I was also not quite strong enough to go and do just a pure maths PhD. But I did have a great interest in cryptography. So it was really a convolution of many things. So I wanted to use pure maths in an interesting way. And really, the only way you can do that, or no, that's not true. Not the only way you can do that, but one of the ways you can do that is by studying cryptography. And so as I approached the end of my final year of my undergraduate, I started looking for good places to do cryptography in the UK, and Royal Holloway was sort of top of the list in a sense, with a real history in cryptography and some academics and professors really working in areas of interest. And particularly for me, it was lattice-based cryptography. And so I went to interview and sweated profusely through 3 interviews, and then went on holiday to find out my degree classification. And when I found out my degree classification, I had a PhD. Like, I wish I could tell you that my life was a well-planned series of events, but it's really very ad hoc. Everything happens at the last moment, and somehow it all works out.
It's really interesting though that you sort of both had an interest in mathematics and history. It's usually one or the other.
Well, yeah, I think this has got nothing to do with cryptography, but I think it's a real shame people who are in charge of the country's pedagogy have this idea that like the social subjects are, kind of soft. I think you have to experience you can't be intelligent in just one direction. I mean, maybe you can be intelligent in just one direction, but it's not true intelligence. And I think nothing can be done in isolation. And you need, even to do pure mathematics properly, I think you need historical context. Like, I think it should feed into your research, even just subconsciously. And I think the CDT is actually very good at that kind of thing, because part of its remit, or part of the reason it gets funding, is because it does interdisciplinary research. Like, it's we have a lot of people with ethnographic backgrounds and sort of geographic backgrounds who come in and ask questions that are sort of like hardcore techies would never think to ask, but can still inspire and guide research. I'm not saying that like I'm not saying that I'm also thinking about people's opinions on things when I try and design a protocol because there's some sort of like hard mathematical truth, but like what questions you ask need to be motivated by something, and the only external motivation is what, say, cryptography is used in the wider society for. And so like having this incredible crucible and melting pot is crucial, right? It can't just come from nothing. I mean, I would be perfectly happy to craft a definition and then try and find whether an object satisfied this definition. Totally circle jerkery, right? That's wonderful. I'd be happy to do that, but like it's not especially useful all the time. So yeah, I think the age of the polymath is sadly over, but people should be as broad as possible.
Absolutely, and I'm really interested to sort of ask a bit more about your experience so far in the CDT and at Royal Holloway. You mentioned that it's very interdisciplinary, but can you tell me a bit more about your experience? What have been the key sort of benefits to you?
The idea that I think I mentioned it a little bit before, but the idea is that while the research we do is technical, we can better inform what research we do. So here's maybe a high-minded example. We have a seminar planned for next Thursday that I'm very excited about. You know, you have these encrypted messaging apps on your phone, and they provide, you know, if you were to dig into the standards and if you were to dig into the like academic literature behind it, you would find some beautifully defined definitions and proofs that this app matches this definition and therefore security and blah, blah, blah. So cryptography as a theoretical discipline is a study of definitions and finding objects that match these definitions. That's fine. But what if the actual needs of the people who are using these encrypted apps are not exactly captured by these definitions, right? So you've proved something, but you've tied something to a definition that's maybe close to what the use case actually requires, but isn't exactly what the use case actually requires. And it's here where the interdisciplinary research, the social side of the research, can really come into force. Like ultimately, to do cryptography, you need to synthesize some sort of formal frameworks and model some kind of definition and prove that you satisfy it. But the synthesis of that definition, in some cases, can be sort of picked because the definition is elegant, because we're all mathematicians and we like elegance, or the definition has some historical context and it's the one that people go for. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying that like standard notions of cryptographic security are wrong. I'm just saying, you know, there can be more interplay between what people actually need. So a use case of encrypted messaging, for example, is used in countries where governments are sort of more preoccupied with spying on their citizens and knowing about their communications, etc. A very simple, straightforward definition is, you know, nobody but me and the person I intend to can decrypt this, right? And you can formalize that by saying this message looks no different from a random string and you can't distinguish between the two. And that's fair enough. And that's probably exactly what people want. But like there are more and more finessed and subtle and more nuanced definitions, which really come from a place of theory, not necessarily a place of practice. And there's this idea of the constructivist perspective of cryptography is that you can find out exactly what those definitions should be if you do, you know, you actually go and speak to the people in these countries who are under surveillance, or you do like an ethnographic study. And so, I don't know, in technical subjects, there can be a real snobbery about purity. And at some point you do need to become rigorous and mathematical, but like, snobbery helps nobody. Like, and specialization is for insects. So, you know, unfortunately, there's not enough time in the day for an individual to know everything, but there is enough time in the day for a department to know everything. And as such, this is where the interdisciplinary strength of the CDT really shines. And like, I have incredible conversations about things I know nothing about, which happens even in my own subject, by the way, but like things I really know nothing about when I talk to the academics and the other fellow PhD students in the CDT who who are looking at things like, period tracking apps and the sort of implicit information security risks of them. None of my definitions cover that. And people who are talking about, say, the protesters in Hong Kong, and how if the networks are shut down, how they might turn to these sort of Bluetooth wireless, so these Bluetooth mesh communications, which are basically totally unsecured, and how these are like real events that inform cryptographic design, or at least should inform more cryptographic design and proof. And it's just glorious. Like, it's so interesting. And if you were not surrounded by such people, you wouldn't have those conversations.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, and it's just the fact that there's this sort of community of people who are all have the same level of inspiration to discover new things and to sort of dive into problems, all very niche. Does really sort of inform your own sort of area of study. So I think you're spot on. So tell me, what do you imagine, or what do you sort of hope the direction of your research goes once you've completed your PhD?
Well, I'll split that into two questions, if you don't mind. The first is like, what do I hope my research so far can help with, and where do I hope it goes in future?
Yep.
So I hope that my research so far is part of a corpus of works that inform, on the really concrete level, parameter selection for these lattice schemes, right? So ultimately, you can design something and you can leave the letter n for like the dimension of the lattice. But one day, when a computer scientist or an implementer comes along and implements it, they have to put a number where that n is, right? And my work so far is largely experimental and heuristic, and says, there's two main threads of it. One of them says, like, these lattice sieves are actually as efficient as we think they are, and here's how expensive they are to run. These lattice sieves being algorithms that break lattice cryptography. And the other is, if I actually had in my bedroom a huge quantum computer under like reasonable, well, actually quite optimistic assumptions about how it would work and how it would run, what do I gain by running variants of these algorithms on quantum computers? And both of those things can say, like, in practice, here's the theoretical reduction, and here is the experimental evidence that like we match or don't match, and that can help with parameter selection. And there's some evidence of maybe of my work helping with that selection process. In the future, I mean, it's a very exciting time, because like I hope to stay in academia for another half a decade. I hope to stay in academia for life at the moment, but you can never prejudge these kind of things. But like within half a decade, the standardization process should have concluded, and then NIST will say, here are X number of algorithms, some of which will almost certainly be based on lattice primitives, and then they are suddenly the high value targets. Like, these are things that people are going to use, or no, people are not going to use them. They're going to be implicitly used on people's behalf when they're communicating. And so suddenly, like, it becomes almost a moral obligation to really strain at the bit against those algorithms that are actually selected. And there will be, other things have been standardized in the past, and the pressure of the gaze on those standardized algorithms has only increased after their standardization, because like these are the things that are now actually used. So I mean, I have my work cut out for many years to come.
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, I guess it makes you generally researching something for this period of time and this early on, I suppose, would fundamentally make you one of the sort of authorities in it in, say, 10 years' time.
10 years' time, I maybe agree with. Like, a PhD is an exercise every day in figuring out how ignorant you are. To find the niche where I'm an authority, you'd have to do a subcategory of a subcategory of a subcategory. But there is such a niche, and hopefully maybe over a decade I can expand it. Like, I'm not so interested in reputation, although that's lovely. I just fear being bored. I never ever want to be bored.
That's a good fear to have. That's excellent. Are you on Twitter by any chance?
Oh, I am. Gosh, yeah. It's quite political. It's not so much about cryptography, although I do occasionally tweet about my works. My Twitter handle is Eamonn which is the first 6 letters of my first and last name. That's EAMONNPOSTLE.
We'll link it on the video anyway.
You will link it, sure. Yeah, I do talk about cryptography there somewhere. It's mostly references to Neon Genesis Evangelion, though. But yeah, if you want to see any of my work, just Google Eamonn Postlethwaite cryptography, and I'm sure oodles of things will appear.
We'll link all the papers that you've sort of published so far. We'll link all them onto the video, and I think it's definitely something that's it would inspire a lot of sort of up and coming cybersecurity experts to explore avenues that they might not be aware of.
Well, that's the hope. I mean, it's a hot research topic for PhD students at the moment, and there's very active mailing lists and quite a few characters, and we're all very nice. So,
what advice would you give anyone sort of looking to get into the field?
I would tell them to. What would I tell them to do? I would tell them to pick a scheme from the NIST competition, and I would tell them to try and read the supporting documentation, look where it's like outlined, and I would tell them that this will be it's like, I don't know what level you're at, you're probably much smarter than I am, but like, I expect this to be very, very challenging and confusing, and then, you know, don't worry about it. Just like sign up to the NIST mailing list, pick a book on cryptography, depending on, say, like what scheme you've picked. Galbraith has a nice book which has some sections on like lattice reduction and so forth. And just like, just immerse yourself and don't be afraid of ignorance. Like when you finish high school, you're like, oh, you know, I sat these exams that I studied really hard for, and I know everything about, I don't know, whatever you study in C4 maths nowadays. And then you go to university and you like realize you know nothing, and then you look at research and once again you realize you know nothing. And the sooner you can stop giving a crap about the fact that you know nothing, the better. Just ask lots of questions and follow your interests, and be pedantic. If there's something you don't understand, just be really pedantic. Or you think something isn't explained very well in prose, like find out one of the authors and email them. The worst they can do is not email you back, and you'll get a reputation for being a pestering idiot, but like, who cares, right? So
that's fantastic advice. It's really, really good advice. Eamonn, it's been fantastic speaking with you, and definitely hope to catch up with you soon.
You know, it was lovely. Thanks for this opportunity.